The Pacific Ocean glimmered beneath the rising sun like a polished blade, calm and silent, betraying nothing of the fury that would soon erupt across its endless expanse. In 1941, it was more than just a body of water. It was a chessboard upon which empires would gamble their futures. On one side stood the Imperial Japanese Navy, a force forged in discipline, wrapped in pride, and armed with some of the finest battleships and carrier groups the world had ever seen. Their officers stood on polished decks with steel in their posture, certain of their superiority. To them, warfare was not merely strategy but tradition, passed down like scripture. Battles were to be won by audacity, precision, and above all, the unbreakable will of the warrior. Across the ocean, the United States licked its wounds. Pearl Harbor had torn through the American fleet like a dagger in the ribs. Battleships lay overturned in oil-slicked water, their hulls torn open like carcasses. Thousands had died before even drawing their rifles. Across the nation there was shock, followed by anger, followed by a cold, disciplined resolve. America would adapt or it would die, and sometimes survival demands abandoning honor in favor of innovation. In hidden workshops, far from the thunder of artillery, another kind of war was being fought. Scientists and engineers huddled around bulky machines covered in dials and flickering lights. They were building something strange, something most admirals barely understood. A device that could see with electricity, a machine that could pierce through fog, rain, and darkness alike. They called it radar, radio detection and ranging. Early versions were clumsy, unreliable, prone to ghost images and false alarms. But there was something there, a whisper of a miracle. The Japanese heard of it too. They laughed. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, reportedly scoffed when presented with captured intelligence about Allied experiments. "Machines do not win wars," one senior officer declared in a strategy meeting. "Men do." Around the table there were nods of approval. Why place faith in equipment when they already commanded the most experienced night fighters on Earth? The Japanese Navy had spent decades mastering combat in darkness. Their lookouts could spot silhouettes on moonless nights. Their gunners could strike targets spotted only by faint glimmers on water. They believed radar was a crutch for weaker navies, and so they dismissed it. That arrogance would cost them everything. The first time radar reached the Pacific battlefield, it didn't arrive with fanfare. It came quietly, humming inside the steel hull of a U.S. destroyer patrolling under a starless sky. The crew was tense. Somewhere in that darkness, Japanese ships prowled. Ships trained for silent approach, for surprise cannon fire, for sudden torpedo strikes. But tonight it was not eyesight that would detect them. Deep within the ship, a young radar operator named Jack Lawson sat hunched over a green glowing screen. Most of the crew barely understood what he did. Even he wasn't confident. But then a blip appeared. Then another. Several. Moving in formation. "Contacts," he whispered into the headset. "Visual?" the captain asked. "Negative," Lawson replied. "No sight, no sound. But they're there." For a moment doubt hung thick. Was this real? Could a machine truly sense what human eyes could not? The captain hesitated only a moment before giving the order. Guns swiveled in silence. Torpedoes prepared. No signal flares. No warning shots. Just coordinates spoken in calm voices. Range confirmed. Fire. The night exploded. Shells tore through the blackness and slammed into steel. Japanese sailors jolted awake as fire erupted across their decks. "Confusion spread like wildfire. Where is the enemy?" "I see nothing." Searchlights spun wildly, but the Americans had already repositioned, guided once again by that strange electric eye. A second volley followed, then a third. One Japanese ship broke in half before its gunners even fired a shot. After the battle, Lawson walked onto the deck and stared at the smoke curling on the horizon. He realized what many others did that night. Radar wasn't just helpful. It was terrifying. It transformed battles from duels into executions. Word of these engagements reached Japanese command centers. Reports described American ships firing with impossible accuracy. Survivors claimed they were being attacked by ghosts. Some junior officers warned, "The Americans are using some form of detection. They can see us before we see them." But the older admirals? They dismissed it. "Coincidence?" one declared. "Luck," said another. Americans always exaggerate. Their laughter echoed down hallways already, trembling beneath the footsteps of change. But Radar was not merely a tool. It was evolving. On American carriers, pilots soon received radar bearings before even taking off. Fighters launched not in random search patterns, but directly along the paths enemy bombers were approaching. Japanese pilots, trained to rely on the sun's glare or cloud shadows to spot their foes, soon found themselves being ambushed from behind, in clear skies with no warning. At first they believed it was chance, but when it kept happening, whispers began to spread among the flight crews. The Americans weren't guessing. They knew. Then came the Battle of the Coral Sea. It was the first carrier versus carrier battle in history. Fleets never saw each other directly. Planes were their eyes and their fists. But the U.S. Navy's planes launched with radar bearings. They struck Japanese ships that had not even begun their scouting sweeps. American pilots made attack runs on ships they could not yet see with their own eyes, but their radio operators calmly read out bearings sent from distant radar rooms. Japanese crews were bewildered. How do they find us first? We launched recon hours ago. Their admirals frowned. We must improve scouting discipline. No one dared suggest something more sinister, that the Americans were no longer fighting blind. Still, even Coral Sea was but a warning. The real disaster came shortly after, Midway. The Japanese believed they had planned the perfect ambush. 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, approached the island of Midway with the intention of crushing the American fleet before it could even react. Yamamoto believed surprise was theirs once again, but surprise had changed sides. American radar detected the incoming Japanese strike groups long before they arrived. Fighters scrambled at the exact moment needed to intercept. Pilots climbed with precision timing, no guesswork, just cold calculation. When the second wave was preparing on the decks of the Japanese carriers, they heard a sound that sent a chill down every spine, the screeching dive of American bombers. They came not from the direction Japanese scouts expected. They came from above, out of cloud breaks, diving at steep angles. And in mere minutes, 3 carriers were engulfed in towering flames. One Japanese sailor later recalled, "It felt as if the heavens themselves had opened to punish us." Midway should have been the moment Japanese command accepted the truth. But pride makes for terrible advisors. Official reports avoided mentioning radar. They cited coincidental enemy discovery and faulty reconnaissance timing. Yamamoto himself, though shaken, still did not overhaul radar development, but others had seen too much to stay silent. In Tokyo, a young naval officer named Hiroshi Tanaka stood before his superior officers with trembling hands. He had studied reports from Coral Sea and Midway. He had reviewed intercepted communications, and his conclusion was clear. The Americans can see through darkness and cloud, he said. They detect us from beyond visual range. They strike with mathematical certainty. This is not luck. This is a device. The room grew quiet. Then an admiral laughed. So you wish to win the war with radios? No. What Tanaka wanted was to survive it. While Tokyo dismissed the threat, American naval strategy evolved at breakneck speed. Radar operators became as vital as gunners. New systems allowed ships to not only detect but track dozens of contacts simultaneously. Destroyers formed picket lines scanning the horizon. Aircraft carriers stationed radar-equipped planes overhead. Submarines even carried compact radar to detect enemy convoys before surfacing. Then came the night battles around Guadalcanal, the true proving ground of radar warfare. Japanese naval doctrine had long emphasized night combat. Their torpedoes were unmatched. Their gunners trained in low-light scenarios. But against radar, their skill meant nothing. On one moonless night, Japanese cruisers slipped toward American positions with the intent to annihilate a supply convoy. They believed themselves invisible. They believed in traditions passed down from masters before them. But their enemies already saw them, not with eyes, but with pulses of radio waves bouncing invisibly across the sea. Aboard the USS Washington, radar screens lit up with movement. Targets pinpointed. Ranges calculated. No searching. No guessing. Commanders issued orders in icy calm. Lock on. Fire as they crossed the coordinate plane. At over 10 miles of distance, beyond any hope of visual contact, shells roared out of American barrels. The impacts landed with such precision that one Japanese captain thought they had hit a minefield. His crew scrambled in panic. Some fired wildly into darkness. Others froze, unable to compute how death could arrive from unseen hands. One Japanese sailor named Masato Ishikawa later wrote in his diary, "We fought shadows. They knew where we were. We did not know where they were. It was like being hunted by the wind." By dawn, 2 Japanese cruisers were sinking. Thousands of sailors floated in oil-slick waters, clinging to debris, staring at a horizon that had betrayed them. Survivors spread the story. Radar, radar, radar. Finally, panic seeped into Tokyo. Radar programs were authorized. Factories began modifying equipment from civilian radio towers, but they were too late. They built machines without doctrine. They deployed systems without training. Veteran officers treated radar as a nuisance, not a necessity. Some ships even turned their sets off to avoid electrical interference with navigation. Meanwhile, Americans refined their deadly efficiency. Radar-guided fire control allowed guns to correct themselves after every shell, walking impacts toward targets with relentless precision. Pilots launched at night, receiving radar vectors mid-flight. Submarines approached convoys using radar pings that reflected off bow waves. Japan was no longer fighting a human enemy. It was fighting mathematics, and mathematics was merciless. As the war dragged into its final years, Japan's proud fleet, once the jewel of the rising sun, dwindled into ruin. Battleships once feared across the ocean were now little more than massive targets. Some were sunk before firing a shot. Others died while running. The ocean floor became their grave. In one of the war's final naval engagements, a Japanese captain looked through his binoculars, scanning waves for silhouettes. The horizon was clear, and yet within moments shells began raining down. He never saw the enemy. His last words before abandoning ship were whispered with disbelief. "Are we fighting ghosts?" No, they were fighting the future. Radar did not just change naval warfare. It changed the meaning of visibility itself. It turned darkness into liability. It stripped stealth from tradition. It punished arrogance without firing a single bullet. In the end, Japan did not lose its navy simply because America built better ships or trained better crews. It lost because it refused to believe in the unseen. Because when presented with warnings of a new era, its leaders laughed. But war does not care for laughter. War does not reward pride. War rewards those who adapt and destroys those who don't. And so, in the dark waters of the Pacific, beneath waves that once carried champions of steel and honor, lies a lesson etched in rust and silence. The greatest enemy is not the weapon you see, but the one you refuse to acknowledge. What radar defeated was more than ships. It defeated a belief system, a philosophy built on the supremacy of human instinct over mechanical precision. For centuries, admirals were taught that victory belonged to those who could see farther, move faster, and strike first. But now sight itself had been redefined, no longer bound to eyes, no longer limited by horizon. Machines could see where men could not, and those who scoffed at such machines were rendered blind. The Japanese Navy did eventually scramble radar units onto their ships. Crude copies of British and American sets acquired through espionage and wreckage salvage. The technology existed, but the culture to wield it did not. Radar operators were treated as background staff, while traditional navigators still climbed the bridge with binoculars, scanning seas they believed were still ruled by human senses. Some ships even disabled radar mid-battle, fearing it would give away their position through electronic signatures. They misunderstood entirely. Radar did not reveal them to the enemy. It revealed the enemy to radar. Meanwhile, American ships were evolving into floating data networks. Radar data from picket destroyers was relayed to cruisers. Carriers received aerial reconnaissance updates from TBM Avengers fitted with belly-mounted radar. Supply ships even carried backup sets. Sailors who once mocked scope watchers now sprinted to relay their coordinates. Promotions were granted not only to deck officers but to technicians who could interpret blips faster than others could blink. But radar's true dominance was not only in advanced detection. It was in the mathematics of fire control. Before radar, naval gunnery at long range was an art. Guess the target's speed, angle, and drift across chaotic waves. Radar turned that art into pure arithmetic. Once contact was locked, the computer, a mechanical analog brain of gears and spinning disks, calculated trajectory corrections in seconds. Every missed shell was instantly analyzed, and the next shot adjusted. Japanese crews still relied on spotting splashes. Americans relied on logarithms. In one battle off Surigao Strait, American destroyers laid an ambush at night. As Japanese ships sailed unknowingly into the crossfire, Radar operators whispered distances with clinical calm. Torpedo salvos launched in perfect synchronization. Cruisers opened fire with full broadsides the moment the enemy crossed predetermined coordinates. It was not a battle. It was an execution done by algebra. One Japanese communications officer, captured after his ship sank, was interrogated aboard an American carrier. He sat quietly as officers asked him about radar. His answer was simple. We thought it dishonorable. Now, we understand dishonor is to die because of foolishness. He wasn't alone. Diaries recovered from sunken ships revealed self-reflection rarely seen among defeated forces. One sailor wrote, "We mocked them for hiding behind machines. But machines do not hide, they see. It is we who hid from reality." Even as late as 1944, some Japanese commanders clung to superstition. A fleet captain ordered his men to cover radar masts with cloth during a night approach, believing spirits interfered with electric waves. Hours later, his cruiser was illuminated by American searchlights, guided directly by radar bearings. His last order was never spoken. A shell ripped through the bridge before he could speak it. Yet there were moments, fleeting, desperate, when Japan tried to catch up. Engineers at the Naval Technical Research Laboratory in Tokyo worked around the clock building the Type 22 radar system. It could detect large ships at roughly 20 kilometers. But while the equipment was functional, doctrine was absent. Captains questioned radar readings if they didn't match what they saw. Some ignored phantom blips. Others chased false returns. Without years of training and trust, radar was just another box of wires. Contrast this with the Americans. A young sailor barely out of high school trusted a flicker on a screen more than a captain trusted his own binoculars. And that made all the difference. In mid-1944, during the Battle of the Philippine Sea, later nicknamed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, radar sealed Japan's fate in the skies as well. American carriers launched fighters guided not by visual spotters but by combat information centers deep within the hull. Operators tracked incoming Japanese strike waves hundreds of miles out. Fighters were vectored to perfect interception points. The Japanese pilots, exhausted from long flights, saw nothing until tracers tore through their wings. Over 300 Japanese aircraft were destroyed in a single day. Radar didn't just see, it predicted. One American pilot later said, "It felt like cheating. They told us exactly where to fly, and when we got there, bam, enemy right in front of us." Japanese survivors who landed back at base wept, not from injury, but from humiliation. They had taken off believing themselves hunters. They returned as prey. Even then, High Command refused to fully concede. Reports were sanitized. Losses were blamed on pilot inexperience. It wasn't until 1945, when American battleships closed in on the home islands themselves, that the truth could be ignored no longer. By then, Japan was deploying kamikaze pilots, men given just enough fuel for one flight. They bypassed radar by flying low across the water, hoping to slip beneath detection arcs. Some succeeded, many didn't. Radar-guided anti-air batteries adjusted angles before pilots even saw their targets. Ships deployed picket screens miles away to warn of low flyers. Suicide tactics could dent American defenses, but could not break them. There is something haunting in the image of a man in a cockpit, gripping his final letter, flying toward a ship he has never seen because it detected him long before he came into view. It is not only tragic, it is symbolic. A nation that embraced death over adaptation met an enemy that embraced adaptation over death. By the war's final year, America's radar technology had reached heights that Japanese commanders could not have imagined in 1941. Long-range search radars could track enemy fleets hundreds of miles away. Height-finding radars calculated altitude for anti-aircraft fire. Even weather patterns were tracked to optimize aerial ambushes. Japan, once confident in divine wind, kamikaze, now faced enemies who predicted the very wind. The Imperial Navy died not in one grand moment, but in 1,000 silent pings that echoed across water. And yet, perhaps the most tragic truth of all, is that not all Japanese officers were blind. Some saw what radar truly was. They wrote warnings. They begged for change. They were silenced by tradition. One final document recovered after the war, written by an anonymous officer likely lost at sea, read, "The Americans do not fight with courage alone. They fight with numbers. They fight with metal. They fight with minds. We relied on spirit. Spirit does not bounce radio waves. In the end, radar was not merely a weapon. It was a mirror. It reflected back the weaknesses of those who refused to evolve. And in that reflection, the once mighty fleet of the rising sun vanished beneath the waves. Not because it was weak, but because it was stubborn. He had been staring at the radar screen for 3 hours straight, eyes dry, muscles stiff, fingers resting on the tuning dial like a pianist before the note. Seaman First Class William Harper was only 19 years old, fresh from Iowa, barely trained on the new SG radar set aboard the USS Helena. The officers called it a marvel. The old-timers called it a toy. Harper called it the thing that wouldn't stop humming. But now, somewhere around 1:43 in the morning, as the ship cut through dark waters near Guadalcanal, that hum began to speak. A blip appeared, then another, then 10, moving, fast. He froze. "Bridge, this is CIC," he whispered into the sound-powered phone, voice trembling. "Multiple contacts. Bearing 041. Range, 12,000 yards. Approaching." There was a pause. Then the calm voice of the watch officer. "Visual confirmation?" "Negative, sir. Black as coal. Understood. Hold track." But Harper couldn't hold. His breathing quickened. He knew what it meant. The Japanese were coming. In the old days, they wouldn't know until lookouts spotted silhouettes. By then, guns would already be roaring and shells already flying. Tonight, Harper saw them miles before they saw anything. He turned, ready to shout, but before he could speak, the ship's intercom crackled to life. "All hands, general quarters. Enemy fleet incoming." The lights went red. Men sprinted down hallways. Boots slammed metal grating. Turrets rotated like giants awakening. Harper felt a rush of energy. He had seen them first. Not with eyes, but through electricity. And because of him, they would fire first, across the water. A very different set of eyes strained against darkness. Petty Officer Masaru Kiyoshi stood on the deck of the Japanese cruiser Furutaka, binoculars raised to a sky so black it seemed to swallow even the stars. He had perfect night vision, or so his instructors always said. He took pride in it. He could spot a mast at 5,000 meters. But tonight, nothing. The captain approached quietly. "Report." "No sight of enemy ships yet, sir," Kiyoshi replied. "Moon is low. Clouds too thick," the captain nodded. "Patience. When we get close, their silhouettes will appear. We strike, and they won't even know we're there." A faint hiss of satisfaction ran through Kiyoshi's chest. Yes, this is how Japan fights. Silence first, steel second, then thunder. Bright flashes lit the horizon, not from lightning, but from hell itself. Water erupted around the ship as massive shells slammed into the sea. One struck the forward deck, erupting in flame. Kiyoshi dropped his binoculars in shock. "Impossible!" he shouted. "They can't see us." "They're firing blind." But they were not blind. They were guided. Shell after shell landed with brutal precision. Men scrambled like ants under boiling oil. Kiyoshi ducked for cover, heart pounding. His mind refused to accept it. How? How do they see us? Where are they? He peered into darkness again and saw nothing but death. Back aboard the Helena, Harper watched the blips split. Some slowed, burning ships. Others retreated. He could barely hear himself think over the roar of guns above. But inside that steel chamber, lit only by radar glow, he felt like a god of foresight. "They never even saw us coming," he whispered. Another night, another ocean, another perspective. Sergeant Hiroshi Nakamura gripped the control column of his Nakajima B-5N torpedo bomber, engine rattling under his feet as he skimmed just above the churning Pacific. 14 planes flew in formation, black silhouettes against darker sea, aiming straight for the enemy carrier group. They had flown low to avoid detection. Veteran tactic. Always worked. "Always would. Remember?" his squad leader crackled over the radio. "They cannot see below cloud cover. By the time they notice, we will already be launching." Nakamura exhaled slowly. "Yes, that is how it has always been." Then, in his headset, "Enemy fighters! Bearing 310! Climbing fast!" But that was impossible. They were miles away. No flares, no signal, no visual contact. How tracer fire erupted through the formation like lightning through dry wood. American F-6F Hellcats burst from below, guns blazing with chilling accuracy. Planes erupted into balls of flame before they even had the chance to react. Nakamura yanked his stick violently, but another fighter was already behind him. He screamed into the mic. How do they know? We are invisible! But radar had drawn an invisible line straight to them. His last thought before impact was not of honor or emperor. It was disbelief. Final shift. Yoshio. Tanabe held onto floating wreckage as dawn bled slowly across the horizon. Oil stung his eyes. Smoke curled into the sky where his ship once sailed. He could hear distant gunfire still, but fainter now. He didn't know which side was winning anymore. He barely cared. A shape drifted beside him. It was his friend, Akira, clinging to a broken plank. They locked eyes. No words. Just exhaustion. After minutes of silence, Yoshio finally spoke. Do you think they saw us? Akira stared blankly, then shook his head. No, they didn't see us. He looked toward the distant American fleet. They knew us. They called it the wolf beneath the waves. But even wolves could not hide. Forever. Lieutenant Commander Samuel Briggs stood in the cramped control room of the American submarine USS Drum. Sweat trickled down his back as he leaned over the radar repeater, a compact version, mounted just months earlier. Submarines were once blind when submerged. They had to surface to scout, forcing sailors to climb the conning tower and scan with binoculars like their grandfathers had. But now, even beneath the waterline, the radar mast could rise just enough to whisper secrets back into the hull. Blip one faint dot. Then two more, a convoy. Merchant ships with escorts. Japanese tankers hauling oil from the Dutch East Indies. The lifeblood of their fleet. Range? 23,000 yards and closing, replied Ensign Harmon, hands trembling slightly. Briggs's eyes narrowed. Surface us. Prepare torpedo tubes 1 through 4. The Drum rose like a silent beast breaching the moonlit water. No lookout was needed, no visual confirmation. Radar was their eye. Briggs raised the periscope only for aiming, not detection. Angle on the bow. 40 degrees. Fire 1. A distant hiss. Then a minute of silence that felt like an hour. Then thunder. The Japanese oil tanker erupted into a column of flame taller than a temple. Alarms blared from the escort ships. Searchlights whipped across the sea, slicing wildly through smoke and darkness. But the submarine was already gone, dropping beneath the waves like a phantom. They don't know where we are, Harmon whispered, awestruck. Briggs didn't reply. He was already watching the next blip return on the scope. On one of the burning ships above, Chief Warrant Officer Koji Sato crawled across the scorched deck, coughing black soot. The flames reflected in his eyes like shattered suns. He heard sailors screaming, felt the heat clawing at his skin, but none of it hurt quite like the realization cutting into his mind. We never saw them. He had led convoy escorts for 3 years. He prided himself on sharp vision, on reading waves and wind. But tonight, the ocean betrayed him. No ripple warned him. No sound whispered danger. A weapon that could strike without being seen felt like dishonor from the gods themselves. As he collapsed beside the rail, he heard someone shout, "Sonar! Find them!" But sonar was their answer to torpedoes. Radar. Radar was something else. Radar stalked before striking. Radar killed before the victim even drew his sword. Koji stared down at the water, whispering hoarsely, "If a warrior cannot see his enemy, is he still a warrior?" Thousands of miles away, a different kind of war was being waged, inside the brain of a single man. Commander Robert Gaines of the USS South Dakota stood inside the Combat Information Center, a dark steel chamber lit only by radar scopes and cigarette embers. Outside, his battleship roared with power. Big guns loaded, engines trembling against the waves. But inside this room, nobody looked through windows. They looked at light. Enemy destroyers detected, bearing 170, closing fast. Gaines didn't even turn. Range? 22,000 yards. Open fire when they cross 18. In the old Navy, captains stood on decks, wind whipping their coats as they watched for flashes in the distance. Gaines did not bother. He commanded war without ever seeing it. His officers relayed orders by numbers, not landmarks. They trusted blips more than sky. Suddenly, his radar operator leaned forward. "New contact, multiple." Bearing 215. Fast movers. Could be torpedo boats. Gaines's jaw tightened. Vector secondary batteries. Plot predictive trajectory. No flare. No whistles. No shouting. Only the hum of electricity and the cold calculation of inevitable death. Minutes later, sailors topside watched explosions bloom across the horizon like fire flowers. They cheered as enemy ships burned, but none of them had seen the enemy approach. They were celebrating a battle already won below deck, in silence. Gaines walked out of CIC, passing through red-lit corridors toward the bridge. On his way, he paused by a young seaman staring out a porthole. "Sir," the boy whispered. "I didn't see anything." "How did we know where to fire?" Gaines stared at him with calm authority. "We didn't need to see them," he replied. "We only needed to know." The sky was orange with fire. Private Daniel Reyes stood behind the 40mm Bofors anti-aircraft gun on the deck of the USS Ticonderoga, hands trembling as he fed shells into the breach. His ears rang with the endless alarm klaxon, "Kamikaze inbound. Kamikaze inbound." The horizon ahead was empty, or so it seemed. "Where are they?" Someone shouted near him, scanning with binoculars. But Reyes didn't look outward. He glanced sideways toward a sailor staring into a glowing radar repeater mounted beside the gun platform. "Bearing 340. Altitude low, 50 feet, the radar operator barked. Reyes whipped the gun around just as a speck emerged from the haze. A Japanese Zero stripped of guns and weighed with fuel and explosives, skimming inches above the waves. The pilot inside gritted his teeth. Flight Officer Kazuo Mori held a photo of his mother in one hand, strapped to his control panel with twine. He had been told the Americans wouldn't detect him at this altitude. "Fly low, below the radar arcs," they said. "Hide in the sea spray." But radar no longer watched only the skies. It swept the ocean surface too. He saw tracers screaming toward him before he even realized he'd been spotted. Reyes squeezed the trigger. The gun bucked like a raging bull beneath him. Shells tore through the air in glowing arcs. The Zero jerked mid-flight, wings shearing away like paper caught in wind. It somersaulted in flames and detonated before reaching the hull. The shock wave knocked Reyes backward. He hit the deck hard, ears ringing. But he heard the cheers. Sailors clapped his back. He saved them, but he didn't feel like a hero. He looked at the black smoke rising and whispered. He never even had a chance, thousands of miles away. On a Japanese cruiser retrofitted with experimental radar, Petty Officer Haruto Akiyama twisted the tuning dial on the Type 21 radar set. The screen flickered with static. His commanding officer paced nearby, clearly irritated. "Any sign of enemy ships?" Akiyama hesitated. "There are..." "Blips, sir. Could be aircraft. Or sea reflections." "The calibration isn't consistent," the officer scoffed. "Your machine invents enemies." "I trust eyes, not ghosts." Akiyama swallowed frustration. He looked again. The blip grew brighter. "Closer." "Sir, I recommend evasive action. Now." "No." The officer walked away. "We maintain course. American radar is overhyped." Minutes later, bombs whistled down from the clouds. Explosions ripped through the deck. Alarms wailed. The captain rushed back to Akiyama, grabbing him by the shoulders. "Can you track them?" Akiyama stared at the screen through tears of anger. "I warned you." High above the Pacific, Lieutenant Frank Dawson piloted his F-6F Hellcat at dusk, the world beneath him swallowed by gray mist. In the old days, pilots relied on eyesight. You looked for sunlight glints on metal, exhaust trails against clouds. But now he flew partially blind and completely guided. "Hellcat 7, come in," crackled a voice in his headset from the carrier's CIC far below. "Enemy patrol at your 2 o'clock, descending. Radar range 12 miles. Climb and intercept." He saw nothing, but he trusted the voice. He banked hard, climbing through cloud. Sweat formed on his brow. 10 seconds. 20. Nothing. Then, dark shadows sliced across his canopy. Zeros. He rolled inverted and dove, guns blazing before they even realized he was there. 2 planes burst into flame. A third tried to brake, but he was already on its tail. He didn't outsee them. He outknew them. Back on deck, mechanics congratulated him. "How'd you spot them?" He shook his head. "I didn't." The war did not end with a final explosion. It ended with silence. In Tokyo Bay, after surrender, American officers boarded the remnants of Japan's fleet. Among them was Lieutenant Harper, the same radar operator who once watched blips in fear. He stood on the rusted deck of the battered battleship Nagato, once Yamamoto's flagship. Now lifeless, silent. He walked past abandoned rangefinders, shattered anti-air guns, and a forgotten radar set bolted to the bridge, cables loose, dust settling on the controls. He placed his hand on it. The Japanese had built radar, but far too late. He whispered, "You could have seen us." A Japanese officer nearby, now a prisoner, overheard. He stepped forward slowly. "We saw you," he said quietly. "We just didn't believe." The rusted deck beneath Harper's boots groaned with age. The war was over now, but its echoes still lingered in the air, woven into the hulls of the ships that had lived and died beneath the rising sun. He looked out across the bay. Ships that once ruled the Pacific now sat motionless like tombstones. No movement, no guns trained skyward, no whispers of orders barking through intercoms. Just wind and water. Nearby, Japanese sailors sat in silent groups, their uniforms tattered, their caps removed, their eyes fixed on nothing. Some stared at their hands as though unsure what to do with them without rifles to grip or rigging to climb. They were no longer warriors. They were witnesses. Witnesses to the moment when time itself turned the page and left them behind. Harper took a breath and walked toward one of them, a gray-haired warrant, officer with bandaged wrists and a face weathered by salt and sorrow. He hesitated, unsure what to say. What did one say to a defeated enemy? What words could bridge oceans of blood? But the man spoke first. "You are the one who spoke of radar," he said in broken English. "The one who said we could have seen you." Harper nodded. The man looked out toward the wreckage that dotted the bay like shattered pride. "We thought honor was not to need machines. We thought courage was enough." His eyes clouded. "But courage cannot stop what it cannot see." Harper said nothing. There was nothing to argue. "Nothing to boast," the old sailor went on. "In our Navy we had sayings. One of them was, 'The warrior must become the blade.' But we—" He paused, swallowing. "We became the hilt instead, unmoving, ornamental. While you forged the blade from signals in the air, the wind shifted. Papers fluttered across the deck. Somewhere in the distance, a bell rang softly aboard an American ship, a ceremonial call for change of watch. The Japanese officer stood slowly, wincing as he rose. He extended his hand, not in surrender, but in recognition. "You fought with eyes beyond human," he said. "We fought with eyes closed." Harper clasped his hand, and for the first time neither side felt superior. Both simply felt human. Time passed. Warships were scrapped. Radar towers rose in their place. Nations that once bled one another now shared blueprints and treaties. The world moved on, as it always does, forgetting the lessons it once paid oceans of blood to learn. But beneath the Pacific, among coral reefs and silent trenches, lie the remains of ships that never understood why they died. Deck guns still point toward the surface as though waiting for orders that will never come. Helmets lie in sand. Compass dials are frozen in eternal bearing. And in one wreck, somewhere near Guadalcanal, a pair of binoculars rests on a rusted railing, forever pointed toward a horizon that no longer matters. Perhaps the sea remembers even when men forget. It remembers the night when tradition met, technology, when courage met, calculation, when one navy trusted instinct, and another trusted electricity, and it remembers which one sank. If you stand today upon the deck of a modern warship, you will not see men squinting into the distance. You will see screens, arrays, dials, dots of light dancing across digital seas. The warrior has not vanished. He has simply traded his sword for signal, his eye for antenna. And somewhere, deep down in the circuitry of every radar system scanning the skies, there is an unspoken oath: never laugh at the future. Because somewhere, someone did, and it sank their navy overnight. The end.